This is going to be recorded. I'm doing it differently than I have in the past. That way we can be sure nothing gets lost. There is our illustrious hero, Joe Hirsch, just popped up on screen. Before we get to him, I want to thank everybody first for being here. Number two, please don't forget that next Thursday evening, we're going to have our book conference. Next Thursday, tiny little book, huge implications. Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. Amazing book, easy read, will make you look at the world very, very differently. So I'm looking forward to that next Thursday. This whole month is thrown off because of Thanksgiving and how we have to change our meeting date. So again, next Thursday, Think and Grow Rich. And next month, I'm going to do a web session on digital co-diagnosis. That way we can work on the real details of how to do this stuff for better case acceptance. So with that, I want to say hello and welcome Joe Hirsch, a friend and somebody who I respect a great deal, an author, a celebrated author. And before I turn it over to him, for those of you who may not have read this book, The Feedback Fix, this is Joe Hirsch's magnum opus so far. You can notice every one of these is something I plan on instituting in my practice, and every one of these is something that I felt I should discuss with my team. So if you don't have this book already, you should definitely go out and look at it. Great reviews, great book, written by a great author. And so I've explained to him before he came here that one of the biggest things that we have to deal with on a regular basis is dealing with our employees. And, you know, just by a show of hands of those of you who I can see, how many of you out there have a hard time being able to give feedback to your employees in such a way that they understand it, understand the long and short-term goals, and don't start crying in your office, right? Suman, you probably have no problem with this at all whatsoever. But my point here is we have an expert in front of us today who's going to help us understand a little bit more, not only about what we say and how we say it and how we relate to them, but after today, you will never, ever again give feedback. Am I correct there, Joe?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. How are you? It's good to see you all. And Glenn, thanks for having me on with your group. It's great to get to know some more orthodontics. My oldest son just actually went into braces, so I have a whole newfound appreciation for what you guys do and what it costs. So thank you all for the good work that you do in making everyone's teeth pretty. Yeah. So, Glenn said that you're never going to give feedback again. I hope that's not true. I hope you still give feedback, but maybe just a little different. And the problem that most people have with feedback is that it's about a past that people can't change or control. And so I wrote this book to help people better understand how they can share a message that allows people to have more control over a future that they still can change, that they still can control. And by shifting from feedback to feed forward, which is something that I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about tonight, we can do all kinds of fantastic things for the people around us to make them become the very best people that they were and are meant to become.
Nice. So in the book, you discussed a great deal about the experience you had being able to learn about how some organizations that are doing it right. You were exposed to Deloitte and their program, and I figured, would you mind talking about a little bit about what you went through in order to come up with the data or understanding the process that you went through?
Yeah. So feed forward is really not just a semantic change or a jargon shift. It really is a fundamental shift in the way that people design and deliver feedback to others. You know, feedback is about the past. Feed forward is about the future. Feedback looks back on the past that people can't change or control. Feed forward looks out to a future that they can. feedback is about blame. Feed forward is about contribution. Feedback is about the finger pointing that we often do with the people closest to us at work and at home. Feed forward is about reaching out, extending a hand. And so there's really a fundamental difference, and this is something that some of the most successful companies and some very successful individuals are starting to do. So we'll start with Deloitte as just one. Deloitte, as one of the world's largest professional services organizations, deals with a lot of entry-level talent. And now that there's all kinds of shifts in talent mobility and distributed workforces, Deloitte, along with some of their other competitors, Pricewaterhouse, Ernst & Young, they're competing in a red-hot environment for millennial talent. And Deloitte realized, like so many others, is that if you want to really attract and retain the best people, you can't just simply tell them about what they've done wrong. You have to help them understand what to do better. You have to make a shift from simply talking about rating to development, to bring in coaching the conversation, and to help people try to intuit on their own what it is exactly that they can do to change and improve. And so one of the things that Deloitte has done is implement a process that allows for much more frequent check-ins between the feedback giver, the manager in this case, and the receiver, the report. And instead of doing a batched analysis of ratings at the end of every quarter and trying to forensically reconstruct a past that no one really remembers anymore, what Deloitte has done successfully is create a system that allows people to have more voice and more choice in the process of how and when feedback is shared. And as the receiver, to be much more active in the process and to have much more input into the process of evaluating performance, so that it's not simply rating, but actually much more of a partnership. It's much more focused on growth and collaboration than simply assigning a number and pegging someone for maybe not reaching a mark or meeting a metric. But there are other organizations that are doing it too. And I suspect that in the world of orthodontics, where you have a very high premium on patient care, really getting to know your patients, building relationships with your patients, having a way to effectively give feedback to some of your frontline providers, whether that's the first person who greets the patient at the desk, or whether that's the person who's prepping the patient for a procedure, that's all critical to the patient experience and to the whole experience that the client, or in this case, the consumer has with your practice. So one of the things that I've observed to be helpful and that research supports is that when you start to boil down feed forward into 6 very specific principles, you can start to operationalize this idea of moving from past to prologue, from the unchanging past to the still unwritten future, from who people are to who they are becoming. And those 6 principles of feed forward, which I talk about in the feedback fix, are actually an acronym known as REPAIR. And there's 6 things that we can do to make an immediate difference in the way that people not just hear what we say, but understand what we mean, so that the kind of feedback we're giving them is leading to lasting and positive change. Here are the 6. REPAIR. R stands for regenerates talent. Feed forward is all about moving the conversation into coaching and development and moving it away from ratings and appraisal. People want to be developed. People don't leave managers, right? People leave the companies with bad managers who didn't support them along their journey. And so taking an interest in your people, whether that's the person at the desk or a nurse prepping a patient, or whether it's your office manager, or whether that's a colleague, someone else perhaps part of your practice, making sure that we gear that conversation always towards developing a person to become the very best they can become. That's the R. E stands for expands thinking. When you give feed forward, we're trying to drive the idea count up, not down. And one great example of a company that's done that is Pixar. Pixar has produced some of the most fantastic and celebrated and highest grossing films, at least animated films, of the last decade. And they've won 20 or so Academy Awards, and they haven't had any allegations of sexual assaults. That's also very good. What Pixar has done really, really well, in a very iterative and yet competitive environment, is they've driven the idea count up by using two simple words: yes and. And so when you get feed forward, the power of yes and, which is kind of like an improv technique, allows people to keep thinking about the idea, and not so much for you to prescribe the fix, but to describe for them a situation and to allow them, the receiver, to start to contemplate that and say, well, how would I handle that? Or you say to someone, you've done really well. I like the way you prep that patient. And what else do you think you could have done to help that patient be really comfortable in the chair? So that power of yes and, of validating but also challenging, is part of expanding thinking. That's the E in repair. Feed forward is also particular. That's P. It has to be very specific. And this research has shown us to be one of the most important features of effective feedback, is that it really focuses on specifics and avoids generalities that all too often become subject to blame and denial and argumentativeness. When you're really specific about that, and maybe we can get into that a little bit more, when you're really particular about the feedback you give, you not only context, you also set a stage for growth and for change. So you have regenerating talent, you have expanding thinking, you have particular. Those are the first three elements of feed forward. And then you get to the last three, which are much harder to do, but are probably the most important parts of this whole concept of moving from the unchangeable past to the still unwritten future. A is for authentic. Feedback is brutal sometimes, and sometimes the truth hurts. But we shouldn't necessarily avoid giving negative feedback just because we're worried about how it's going to land. You know, people try to avoid giving negative feedback. You all probably, as we all do, are uncomfortable with the idea of telling someone something negative about their performance. And the reason we resist giving negative feedback, even when it's authentic, is because we're concerned that this person's maybe too dumb to get it, or not mature enough to get it, or it's simply not nice. And who wants to be not nice? So negative feedback has the stigma attached to it, but the research is actually quite surprising. It paints a totally different picture. And that's, as long as the feedback is given with care and commitment, then it doesn't matter if it's negative. It will actually help people become better versions of themselves. Creative, more responsive, longer lasting change, longer lasting implementation. So regenerating talent, expanding thinking, particular, and authentic. But feed forward also has to make an impact. That's I in repair. It has to be geared towards creating lasting and positive change. A wonderful example of an organization that did that really well is Cleveland Clinic, where if you want, if you're sick, you want to get sick and go to Cleveland Clinic. They're one of the world's best healthcare providers, ranked number one in cardiology since hearts existed, and in many other fields as well, right? So you think, oh, Cleveland Clinic, they're fantastic. Their doctors are wonderful, top of their fields. Cleveland Clinic had a big problem about 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, when the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid started coming out with their rankings based on the age caps, those surveys that patients have to fill out after they receive medical care for an inpatient stay, they realized that Cleveland Clinic's patient experience, the care that was being provided, not the quality of care, but the care itself, the bedside manner, was actually ranked in the lowest 4% of more than 4,000 hospitals surveyed in the United States. That's the bottom 4% of 4,000 hospitals. None of those hospitals could hold a candle to Cleveland Clinic in terms of the intellectual capital, in terms of the expertise, the clinical diagnoses. But when it came to actually caring for patients, they were awful. And so Cleveland Clinic did a lot of soul searching and came up with a number of different interventions that were designed to make an impact on the way that feedback is not only shared and structured, but delivered and ultimately implemented. And at the time, rounding was not a common practice, at least in pulmonary and in some other floors in the hospital. And going to a rounding system where all the various providers on the floor would round on patients and then discuss with each other. So rounding, but then sort of huddling after to discuss the results and pulling together all the different pieces of observational data actually helped clinic practitioners become much more aware of what it is they weren't doing well and how they could actually raise the bar on the care. And a few years later, after going through this really painful process of trying to deliver feedback that makes an impact, Cleveland Clinic actually rose back to the top 3%, from bottom 4 to top 3 among all healthcare providers in their HCAP scores. And finally, the last of the repair method is refines group dynamics. And this is also hard because when you get feedback, especially if it's negative feedback and authentic feedback, it can have a challenging effect on your team. What does that do to morale? What does that do to team dynamics? But with Feed Forward, we actually refine team dynamics by bringing other people into that conversation. So let me get specific. Let's say you own a practice with 5 individuals, a smaller practice. You have a co-owner, sort of a junior associate, you're bringing up the ranks, and you have 2 nurses and 1 person at the front desk. Let's say one scenario there. When you give Feed Forward to your office manager, it's not done outside of the context of the others. It should be all together. And some of these concepts are quite revolutionary, and really only some of the bravest companies are doing it. One is Bridgewater Associates, like the world's most successful hedge fund. Ray Dalio, who's the CIO, Chief Investment Officer for Bridgewater, has just come out with a tome called Principles, where he kind of collected, I think, 1,500 principles of practice that he found in his work. Ultimately, guys, is radical transparency. They are not afraid to tell each other in each other's company how they're doing. And by doing that, they help everyone know just what needs to be done to get better and where people stand. Because ultimately, as Dalio puts it, we want to work in an environment where people know where you stand, where people know what you think about them, and not where they don't know what you think about them. That leads to confusion and chaos. Radical transparency, which is really the last piece of Feed Forward, is about telling people together as a team what we can all be doing better together, and tapping the hidden team genius that exists within your team, within your practice, to help people deliver their thoughts and suggestions for improvement, and to how to make the situation better, or how to make people's practice better. So repair, a 6-part formula for giving Feed Forward, moving out of the unchangeable past and into the still unwritten future, moving it from past to prologue, not focusing on blame, but instead focusing on contribution, not focusing on who people are, but on who they are becoming. It's not easy to do, but when it's done right, Feed Forward has an unmistakable impact on the way people work as a team, the ability of people to become resilient and stand on their own 2 feet, to start solving problems on their own and not waiting for their boss or manager to do it for them, unleashing the creativity that exists within teams, and finally allowing people the opportunity to really play an active role in their own, to in charge of their own. Everyone wants to be the best they can, and everyone wants to have a say in that process, because people don't fear change, they fear being changed. And if we can take the fear out of the change process by bringing people into that process, we'll go a long way to helping people become the very best versions of themselves.
Very nice. Very nice. So, Joe, mind if I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah.
Cool.
Starting with how much my kids' braces cost.
Yes, $4,100.
Yeah.
So,
Close.
Yeah, I don't
Feet
think.
up. Feet up.
Yeah, I know where you're getting your braces done, and it's not $4,100. Just so you know, just for the group's sake, his kids are being treated by someone who's arguably one of the greatest orthodontists I've ever met, and he's here in Dallas, and we're lucky. So first of all, to the group, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat so that I can then bring them up to Joe and give you an opportunity to ask. But if you don't mind, let me start with a couple of questions just based upon my day-to-day experience, if you don't mind. So you mentioned a number of things. Let's talk about feedback relative to the situational versus the planned. So I see somebody treating a patient and they make an egregious error, something that should never happen. It's a big deal. It influences and affects the quality of care, versus I want to check in with a person and give them overall feedback about a broader issue. Is there an appropriateness for stopping somebody and giving them feedback at that point? Or do you just sort of stop what's going on and later on, do you do it immediately, or do you go back and you say, I need to speak to you later? What tends to work better for an acute situation, and how often should we be checking in with them from a sort of a more broad range, monthly, weekly, yearly sort of thing?
So in matters of real patients and real care in real time, I think it's a little different than someone not turning in their earnings sheet or their sales sheet, on time. So when you're dealing with real people and real lives, I think real-time correction is very important. And then the debrief, which follows, is even critical. We'll get to that just in a minute. But I think if there's a patient care issue on the table, just for the broader issues of performance, and really shifting the conversation away from performance management, which has a very static ring to it, because you can't really manage someone's performance. Only they can manage their own.
Uh-oh, we lost Joe. I'm going to carry on the rest of this for all of you, okay? So I was just going to, there's Joe. Joe, are you back?
I'm here.
No problem.
Okay. Sorry about that.
You said you can't, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it just timed out on me for some reason.
Sorry.
So when it comes to issues of acute care in real time, when it comes to sort of the broader conversation around performance management, which again, I don't love as a term, because you don't manage their performance. They have to manage their own performance. So talent development, helping them develop their own talent, helping them uncover their own potential, that's really at the heart of this. I think depending on the nature of the practice and how accustomed the team is to getting together to discuss matters relating to the practice, would influence how often these conversations occur. Certainly in an environment where people are comfortable talking to each other, and it's a smaller practice, it's not distributed, it's one office, I think that having conversations weekly is super helpful. Weekly huddles, end of the week, or maybe beginning of the week, allows for a much more fluid conversation and exchange of ideas, and people know where everyone stands. And if it doesn't happen frequently enough, a lot gets left to the side. When it comes to matters of individual performance, with what we'd call the performance review, that is something that should probably happen semi-annually, because once a year is too infrequent. More than that, it loses its effectiveness, and also probably doesn't yield valuable data. An approach that has worked well in small size companies, small to mid-sized firms, especially, it's not your guys' field, but in financial services, like Deloitte, or in law firms, where I've worked with some clients, they actually do really well with weekly check-ins, and then they actually go to quarterly performance snapshots of the employee. And a performance snapshot unlike the review, is much more of a conversation based on sort of the weekly coaching conversations, the weekly check-ins that have been happening in the interim. So over the course of a few weeks, you, the manager or the owner or, of the business, you're gathering all kinds of data about the person. You're sharing information with them. They have the opportunity to have a say-so in what they're hearing. So it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. It's not finger pointing, it's arm extending. And then every quarter or so, every few months, to have a snapshot of performance, which is useful for the employee as a goal-setting mechanism. So rather than simply handing them something that is now in concrete, based on a past they can't change, which is what most reviews are, right? Reconstructions of past events that people can't do anything about anymore because they've happened 6 months ago or longer. The performance snapshot sort of captures where you are right now, what you can be doing better. And I like my performance snapshots to have 2 columns. It's things that I, the feedback giver, noticed, and things that you, the receiver, observed or wanted to add to, or, layer with context. And the reason that's so important is because the snapshot, again, is not just me, the giver, looking out at you and telling you what I see. It's also reflective of what you, the receiver, see. Glenn, the analogy I would use for this is feedback in the traditional sense is a lot of window gazing. It's me looking out a window and telling you what I see. You're on the other side of that window. You can't speak back to me. My view is one directional. What I see is the truth. We don't know or care what you see. And ultimately, it's about prescribing a fix. Whereas mirror holding, which is really at the heart of Feed Forward, mirror holding is much more of a dialogue. In fact, when I'm holding a mirror up to you, all I see is the back side of the mirror. I can't see what you see. You, the receiver, are the only one with a view. And you describe what you see. Rather than me prescribe what it is that is looking back at you, you tell me what you see. And we begin a conversation that allows for much more insight and much more action. Because once I actually know what you're thinking and what you're feeling, I, the feedback giver, if I'm listening closely enough, I can start to understand maybe where the breakdown's happening, maybe where additional coaching and support is needed, maybe where I'm totally off base and had a completely inaccurate view the entire time. So mirror holding is a much more effective technique than window gazing. Window gazing doesn't really yield critical insight. Mirror holding does. And ultimately, mirror holding puts the responsibility squarely into the hands of the person responsible for making that change, and that's the receiver.
So if I may ask you, Joe, let's just, first of all, I know this is a quick answer. Everything you're discussing here is scientifically backed, right? It's not just, right? This has been shown to increase performance and team building and all those other things that we all strive for. I just wanted to make that clear that this isn't some, psychobabble where you say, well, our feelings all matter, right? Because it tends to get discounted very quickly if people feel that way. So if you will you indulge me so that I'm your assistant. I'm in charge of ordering the supplies for the office, and you are the orthodontist. You're the head of the team, and just yesterday I couldn't do what I needed to do because the supplies that you're in charge of ordering were not there, and I had to look a mom in the eye and say, hey, Mrs., I don't know, hello, Mrs. Shaw. I'm sorry you came down here today, but those brackets I was going to put on your daughter, we're missing a couple. They didn't come in yet, and I'm so sorry, right? And a pretty much inexcusable failure, at least from my perspective as the owner of the practice. So now you're the owner. I'm the assistant whose job or responsibility it was. And I think that's a quasi-common kind of thing we feel in our practice. How do I approach it from there? What would you say to me? What would you do? Where do I go from there so that I don't have a crying assistant who goes home and screams at her husband, "You won't believe how he yelled at me. I need to find a new job. This guy rides me too hard. It's not my fault."
That's a great scenario. So first thing is context. It's important to set the stage for that conversation. And in that moment, when you see it happen, I would tell your assistant right away, let's find a time later today to talk about this. It's important. So they know already that that conversation is going to be happening, and it's not a gotcha where you just grab them on their way out the door and they feel caught off guard and berated. Once you've set a time to meet with them, I would ask for permission to give feedback. That's very disarming. It seems like a silly thing, you as the owner of the practice, as the person with years and years of experience and the degrees and the certification and the acumen, to ask permission to give your employee feedback, but it's actually extremely effective. Research shows that when you ask permission to give feedback, it disarms the person, the parts of the brain that actually go into threat response. The amygdala, which actually goes into hijack mode once we're confronted with negative news, it actually settles a lot of the stressors and the cortisol that raises people's threat awareness. So ask for permission after setting a time. And then I would start by stating a fact. Glenn, we'll call your assistant.
Call him Glenn. It's fine.
We'll call your assistant. Well, I'm thinking of someone in particular here who actually didn't order your supplies. You know that person? That sounds a lot like an April to me. It's an April. It's an April.
April did it.
April. It's all her. April. So the brackets that we had ordered today for Mrs. Shaw's kid, they weren't there. And April will say, right. So you've stated a fact. You've also set a context for the conversation. And then you'll ask a simple question. You'll say, what happened? Because right now you're tuning. You're not accusing. You're opening the conversation. And let her talk. Remember, it's mirror holding. So April says, yeah, I really meant to order those brackets. And I tried several times. Our server was down today, and I couldn't place the order online. I called them up by phone, but at that time, customer service had left for the day, and so I couldn't get the new shipment in, but they're expediting something. I called another provider. We'll have it tomorrow. I'm really sorry. I tried my very best. Well, now you just realized something that maybe you didn't know before. It wasn't that April dropped the ball. There was some other factor getting in the way. Maybe the server was down, right? She tried. She couldn't do it. Okay, so maybe that's a rosy example, and it doesn't always work out that way. But you'd be surprised how many times we are wrong about other people based on the assumptions we make about their performance. And by giving them a chance to actually explain and frame the conversation with their own perspectives, it's a very revealing and ultimately more productive way to have the conversation. But let's be honest. Why weren't the brackets there? It's because April screwed up. The server was working just fine. There was no problem. The problem was that April wasn't responsible. And so now you have the conversation, same way, let her know when is coming in the moment, let her know, April, I think we should talk about this later. Let's find a time to speak. How's 4:30? Great. Now you're sitting down. April, I'd like to, with your permission, give you a little bit of, with your permission, never say give you a little feedback. With your permission, talk to you about what happened today with Mrs. Shaw's kid. And April will start to get a little edgy and probably uncomfortable. And then you'll say, April, the brackets weren't there. Again, setting the context, stating the facts. So there's clarity about what is being discussed. April, what happened? And April's like, geez, I really meant to. I meant to, Doc. I just forgot. I'm so sorry. I'll do better next time. At that point, you can do one of two things. You can either say to her, darn right you will, but that probably won't change the behavior. That's our instinct, right? To vent, to ascribe blame. That's feedback. With feed forward, you wouldn't do that at all. You would say, Well, that was really unfortunate. Her kid didn't have braces. So setting the emotions, letting her know what impact it had on others. Because she, in this instance, April, isn't trying to do any harm to anyone. If you asked her, is it your goal every day, April, to screw over a patient so that they don't have their brackets and to make me, as the dentist, look bad for not having my supplies? Of course she'll say no. So when you tell her about the impact that it had on both you and others, that builds a certain awareness that already makes people say, gosh, I'm letting someone down. I really need to do better because I don't want to let other people down. Once you start making it about her, she becomes defensive and puts up a barrier. When you make it about you and others who are affected, you just use feed forward to shift the conversation into the future, not into the past. And you'll say, April, the brackets weren't there, and because of that, Johnny Shaw couldn't get that bracket replacement that he really needed, and he's going to have to come back tomorrow when the brackets are in, and it's really inconvenient to them. And now you've set the context, and you end with one final question. And you say, so what do you think we could do to prevent this from happening again? Now, she knows it's not supposed to happen again. So you telling her, don't let it happen again, is not effective, because she already knows that. You need to take her to the next step. You need to expand her thinking with a yes and. Yes, April, this is very bad. And how do we stop this from happening again in the future? What can we do? What can you do? And what can I do to support you to make sure this doesn't happen again? And then you don't talk. You stop. And the silence that ensues can be uncomfortable. It can be awkward, but in that silence is where all the discovery happens. People can't automatically come to these things on their own. They need a moment to think. And so let them think and listen. Listen through the silence. April will inevitably come up with something. She'll tell you something. And then you listen again and you keep asking. Remember, it's a yes and. You want to keep the idea count going up and don't shut it down. Keep holding that mirror to the other person so that that person can continue to think for themselves about how to avoid it again. Because ultimately, unless you, the owner of that practice, are going to take responsibility for ordering supplies, it is on this person to do that. You are trusting this person with the responsibility of taking care of your practice. You cannot do that. And so you want to enable this person to come to a self-realized solution that they can own and do and can become, right? So telling them and prescribing, that's not helpful. But questioning and listening and prompting, that is helpful. That is what pushes the person towards a self-realized solution, a self-recognized fix. And that's how you get a feedback fix. You don't tell someone what they did wrong because it's in the past and it's blame and it's not likely to create lasting and positive change, and it's only likely to create threat awareness, denial, and accusations, and ultimately distrust and discord. With Feed Forward, listening, asking questions, prompting, holding a mirror, allowing the person to see it for themselves, because like I said before, we're afraid to give feedback because we sometimes think the person is, not mature enough to handle what we have to say. It's going to land too harshly, or they won't understand us, or we don't want to be viewed as mean. But ultimately, if there's clarity about what the feedback is about, there's a genuine expression of trust and interest in helping the other person, and there's a really authentic sense that I, the feedback giver, don't have all the answers. I'm merely bringing an issue to your attention. I want to hear what you have to say about it. I want you to take ownership of it, is ultimately far more effective than anything that we do when we give traditional feedback, which more often than not is rejected.
All right. So I love it. I'm going to start implementing that tomorrow. The question is, what happens? When do you draw the line where one feels, right? We often give up quickly on employees when we don't need to. Oh, I've talked to her 3 times already. Where do we draw the line and say, okay, I had a talk with April last week, and just a week later now, I'm out of brackets again. And I know I bring her in, hey, April, can we find some time later on to talk about this? How does 4:30 sound? 4:30 comes. Hey, April, do I have your permission to talk about what happened today with Mrs. Smith and the brackets? And she might start to say, yeah, I know, right? At what point do we sort of say, you know what, this just isn't working out? Or do we never give up on people? Do we continuously try to offer them that feed forward? Do we continuously work this until the point where we just want to strangle ourselves or pull our hair out? Or do we set very clear examples at that first meeting that say, hey, April, I agree, everything you said, yes, and so here are the quantifiable results of what happens the next time this happens?
Yeah, it's a great question. Every feed forward encounter has to lead to impact, right? That's part of repair. It has to lead to some concrete, actionable, measurable step that both sides can clearly identify and point to as the path to success. And so after that first encounter with April and the missing brackets, there should be some documentable, measurable action steps that April can take and that you guys can work on together. Because unless it's measured, it can't be managed, as Peter Drucker used to say. And so this is really important. Now, after a couple of times, I mean, it's really going to depend on you guys, but it's, to me, after a second offense, using this approach, giving the person an opportunity to really be part of the solution, you have to come to the realization at some point that not everyone is ready to change. No amount of feedback, no amount of priming and prepping can actually force someone to be the change that they have to become. Only they can. And so at that second offense, if it's really egregious and not something that is staged over a path of progress or a continuum of time, right? Because forgetting to order brackets once, okay, it happens. Forgetting twice is highly unusual and probably just shows lack of responsibility. Whereas patient relationships and communication skills, that's not something that's a one-off. That's not something that someone can fix right away. And so there you probably would give more of a runway for the person to grow. And in fact, in the staging process, don't just come up with action steps, but mile markers or pebbles, if you will, right? Instead of a milestone, that's your end goal. I want you to become much more communicative with patients and friendly. Pebbles along the way that line the path of progress.
Okay. No, I love it. Brandon, you had a question you wanted to ask about performance snapshots. I unmuted you.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
I was curious how long a typical performance snapshot would take. If you're doing these, once a quarter with however many employees you have, what's a good amount of time to be enough, but not to be a drain on, to have them go on and on and on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. When Deloitte started going to performance snapshots, they asked just 4 questions of the manager to provide input on the reports. 4 very simple questions. Among them, would you hire this person to work for you? And do you think this person deserves to be promoted? Now, the reason why those questions are really good is because they focus on the potential that still resides within that individual and asks the manager not so much how the person is doing, but how they might still be doing down the road, like to imagine their performance beyond right now, maybe 6 months out. Performance snapshots are really meant to be quick. They're meant to be almost like a dipstick measure of how the person's doing. And the sharing of that information with the employee shouldn't take very long at all, because time is really at a premium for everybody. And these conversations are really just meant to provide instant feedback to the person in a way that gives them a roadmap for improvement, at the same time not overwhelming them with possibilities. Research tells us that if anything stands in the way of people making a change in their performance and their practice, it's being overwhelmed by decisions. Our brains actually go into shutdown mode when we're overwhelmed with choices. Today's election day, so there's actually some really interesting research about what happens with voter fatigue when they start to go down the ballot. The ballot choices that are actually listed last, whatever the measure is, that's listed last is the one that is almost automatically going to be checked yes in the affirmative. There's actually a really fascinating case study of 8 judges, veteran judges who had heard thousands of cases for parole. And researchers studied their decisions in these cases, and they found that later in the afternoon, these judges more than likely denied parole than granted it. And the reason for that wasn't because of the egregious crime or the culpability of the assailant, but rather the judges at the end of the day, after going through maybe a dozen or so cases, were simply fatigued. And in cases of fatigue, a judge will do what a judge normally does in a default setting, and that is deny parole. And so your chances of being paroled actually were better if your case was heard in the morning than in the afternoon. So going back to your point, Brandon, giving information that is kind of crisp, that is clear and to the point, not overwhelming, and yet actionable is the best way to provide the snapshots, because again, it's just a snapshot. It's not a panorama. It's not a montage. It's a snapshot. So it's got to be quick. It's got to be clear. It's got to be actionable.
So Joe, the snapshot is given in a verbal, you mentioned something about columns earlier during your talking about snapshots. Is my snapshot calling you into the room and saying, hey, April, just wanted to give you some quick feed forward, so to speak? I've read books where they talk about, excuse the expression, a crap sandwich, right? Where you say something like kids get at school, right? Johnny's such a great boy. He beats the living heck out of all the other kids, but I know he's a sweet kid and we can fix this, right? What's called a crap sandwich, you squeeze in the bad. In a performance review, is it all just, here's what I'm seeing currently, and here's where we'd like you to be? What are your thoughts on this?
So there is some actual documentation, because that helps frame the conversation. So when I mentioned the columns, these performance snapshots actually, if you're doing it right, if you're doing these check-ins weekly, and check-ins are casual, they're quick, they're not a sit-down, it's very informal. But all that data, if you will, that you're impressionistic information that you're gathering in the course of these check-ins is going to frame the snapshot that you have with the employee once or so a quarter. And there, the 2 columns are helpful, because what I see and what you say is going to help to put together a more complete picture of progress. So if in the course of these weekly check-ins, I'm seeing something and you're telling me it's this, well, that helps us set near-term goals. In the case of the brackets, well, what do you think needs to happen? Well, I probably need to make a reminder on my calendar to order the brackets. So one of the things that would then find its way into the performance snapshot would be organization, right? I am seeing that at times you need support in organization. We talked about this. You said that having a reminder, your thought, not mine, on your calendar would be helpful. And so now, because we framed that together, I look back over the last few weeks, and in my performance snapshot, I can say, based on the points that we have come up together, here's what I'm seeing. Here's a snapshot of your performance based on some of the metrics and measures that are really important to both of us, and the ways in which you and I thought that we could support your growth and development. And in the course of those conversations, we have a plan. And that performance snapshot is now the plan that is the basis for setting the next term goals, which would then be supported with weekly check-ins, would carry you through all the way until the next observation point, the next snapshot point, where again, you're reporting on progress. And after 2 quarters, you're now maybe at a semi-annual performance review, where you may have a checklist, or you may have a punch list of important competencies that you need to have, or you've got their job description and you've got what they're actually doing. So the theoretical of what they ought to be doing and the practical day-to-day of what they are, and you can meet those two. But it's a much richer conversation, Glenn, when you do it this way, because number one, you've taken subjectivity out of the process. Subjectivity kills conversation when it comes to people's performance, because when it's subjective, it's completely open to debate and denial. When it's something that is shared and discussed and is based on observable events, it is no longer subjective. There are no more surprises. It is not up for debate. These are the issues we're dealing with. Here's what I've seen. Here's what you've said. We have framed it in an objective, non-threatening, authentic environment that diffuses the tension that too often comes in a performance review setting. Now you can go back to those 6 elements of feed forward. You can start to regenerate the talent in your teams by helping to push them forward to that next level of excellence or competence, by really having captured their thoughts, expanded their thinking, you've been particular and you've been authentic about it. So now you talk about ways to make that impact and the way to improve the dynamics that are going to exist within your team by working together on facts, not feelings, on data, not daydreams. It's really all very specific and it's measurable, because you can't measure and you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you don't measure, then you're really just aiming in the dark.
Right. So we're getting close to the end of the hour. And I want to give anybody, I had one more question, but I want to give everybody else an opportunity to ask. Does anybody else here have a question you'd like to ask Joe right now? Going once. So with nobody else asking right now, Joe, the final question I want to ask, and like I said, I've typed maybe 20 questions I could ask you right now. And I read the book, right? So we're talking about feedback, and you let me know if this is within your purview right now or if this is a future project. How does all of this come down to the hiring process, right? Is there anything we've learned about feedback and feed forward and criticism, so to speak, constructive feedback, and how we hire? Does any of this go back into the hiring process and how we ask questions there? And sorry for slipping this one on you.
Yeah. No, it's not an area that I've focused on really intently. I have seen a number of different case studies on best practices in hiring. And one way I think the two really do intersect is that if you know this is important to you, that you want to create a culture where feed forward is a part of the everyday conversation of your team, where you want people to be able to trust each other and talk to each other in the most authentic and candid way, then I think that influences the kinds of questions you might ask in a hiring interview. You might ask someone, here's how we do things around here. How would you take to that if someone came over to you and actually tried to have a check-in with you? Or how do you feel about performance snapshots? What's your experience with performance reviews? What do you feel is lacking? I'm completing a doctorate right now in educational leadership. And the focus of my dissertation, which will be finished by May, is what studies the attitudes of educators towards traditional feedback versus a multi-rater feedback system where you're getting feedback from lots of different sources. And through my research and through the actual study design that I've implemented, it's really clear. It's super clear that people, this is something that actually has much higher favorability, has much higher chances of success, and ultimately is adopted with less resistance and blowback than traditional feedback, which puts people on guard, which rubs people the wrong way, and ultimately doesn't lead to positive and lasting change. Ultimately, our job as managers, as owners of practices, as care providers, as parents, as educators, is to help people become the very best that they can be. And the reason I wrote this book, and the message that I hope that everyone takes from it, is that when you give feed forward, you are sharing a kind of feedback that allows you to get what you want while giving others what they need. Get what you want, give others what they need. And it allows people to become the very best versions of themselves, a future that they can change and control.
I love that. So before all of you leave, real quickly, this is the book, The Feedback Fix. Help this guy pay for braces or Invisalign. Hey,
I'll have to sell many books in order for that to happen.
Yeah. So in short, I'm saying help an orthodontist and buy this book. So first of all, I read it. Obviously, it's an awesome book. It's really great for interfacing with your team, and I'm not strong at that. Number two, Joe, if anybody wants any more resources, if they want to talk to you about maybe bringing you into their office or consulting, I don't know if you do that sort of thing. I don't know if you have workshops that you want to talk about, but where would anybody go if they wanted to learn more about how to work with you?
Yeah. You can find me online at joehirsch.me. That's JOEHIRSCH. Maybe just stick that in the chat there, Glenn. Thanks. joehirsch.me. And thank you. And you can actually read more about the book, see more about the research. You can look at some of my offerings for people like you who I think are working in a really highly volatile and yet extremely caring environment. About how I've been successful at helping other organizations do just that. And ultimately learning how to become the very best version of yourself. Feed forward is not a magic bullet. It's not a panacea. Ultimately, it's about showing that you care and caring to show that you care. And by doing that, we help others become the best they can be, and we help ourselves get what we need and want most.
Yeah, and so I've spoken to Joe a little bit, and we're in preliminary conversation about maybe next May, the day before the Orthopreneurs meeting, maybe doing a workshop with him where he can work with us a little bit on feedback for our teams and making us better at that. So we're in discussions. But I can tell you before I let him go, we have a lot of people on these webinars. I know Joe personally and can tell you that he is as authentic in real life in trying to help people as he has been on this webinar. What you see here is who he is in real life. And if you ever do work with him, you will find him to be just a master educator and an extremely patient man, as is illustrated by his friendship with me. So that said, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody here in the Orthopreneurs RD group. Thank you for the time. I know how busy you are. And if anybody needs to reach him, you can find him at joe@joehirsch.me, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah.
So please feel free to reach out to him. If you need anything and you can't get him, reach out to me and I'll find him for you. But thanks again, everybody. And don't forget, next Thursday, Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, amazing book. Then you get a little bit of a break for a few weeks. And I'll put my webinar up for my digital co-diagnosis for next month. And this is not the last we will see of you, Joe. So thank you. Very
Wishing
much.
you guys all the best in your endeavors. Help make everyone's smiles beautiful, and thanks for being part of the conversation tonight. I enjoyed learning with you.
This has been recorded. It will go up. Have a great evening, everybody, and thank you for being here.